I looked, it was like 22,000 cryptocurrencies. And, I think we all kind of agree that that's ridiculous, and 99% of those will fail. And that will leave you with, I hope, somewhere between 15 to 100 that will be useful. And we're seeing things like Chainlink outperforming. We're seeing things like Thorchain outperforming.
Hello everyone, and welcome back to another episode of The Pragmatic Investor. My guest today is Mike Fay, fellow essay contributor and the author of the Heretic Speculator on Substack. When it comes to cryptocurrencies, Mike is one of my favorite experts to follow. He's incredibly knowledgeable when it comes to all the altcoins and what's going on in the markets. So, given that alt season is upon us, I think this would be a great time to get Mike's thoughts on Bitcoin and a lot of various altcoins. We started today by getting straight into the altcoins and covering specific names that we like and maybe others that we don't like so much. We then talked about the general market, Bitcoin, Ethereum, the regulatory environment, and I also got Mike to talk a little bit about the general market and how he sees this playing out in terms of the coming crypto bull market. To wrap up, we also got the chance to talk a little bit about politics, as I'm currently here in Buenos Aires, Argentina. We talked a little bit about the situation here. It was great catching up with Mike. Always a pleasure. I believe this is the fourth time he's been on the podcast, and definitely a great person to follow if you're interested in cryptocurrencies. So go ahead, do yourself a favor and go follow Mike. Link will be on the description. And if you haven't already, you can also follow The Pragmatic Investor on Substack, YouTube, or Spotify. As always, I hope you enjoyed this conversation as much as I did. All right, welcome back to the show, Mike Fay. Thanks for coming.
Thanks for having me again. It's always fun.
Yeah, thanks for making time in this busy time of holidays. Obviously, we have Christmas approaching, holiday season, but already in full swing, altcoin season, which has crept up on us. What are your thoughts there? I mean, altcoins, looking back a month ago, 2 months ago, obviously sentiment was completely in the gutter, and everything's shifted. What's your take?
It's been interesting. I think that, in the past, you've seen, in previous cycles, we've seen kind of like all of the altcoins sort of like rallying at the same time. And maybe you'll have one that's running and then it tops, and then people, take that profit and throw it into something else. And I think that this time I do think will be a little bit different. That's just a suspicion of mine, more so than anything that I'm seeing in data specifically. But I think that we're going to see more of a flight to what could be perceived as quality altcoins. Because I don't even know what the outstanding number is now. I think the last time I looked, it was like 22,000 cryptocurrencies. And, I think we all kind of agree that that's ridiculous, and 99% of those will fail. And that will leave you with, I hope, somewhere between 15 to 100 that will be useful. And we're seeing things like Chainlink outperforming. We're seeing things like Thorchain outperforming. A couple others, Avalanche, Solana, some of the smart contract chains that compete with Ethereum from a fees standpoint, at the user level, have done pretty well. The native currencies of those have done well. I think what we got to pay attention to is stablecoin market. We've had an interesting kind of decline from the peak of the stablecoin market down to, I think, like 120 billion or so combined market cap of all stablecoins. And that's finally looking like it has maybe found a bottom, as we've seen some of the currency come back into that market. And that's good for DeFi, which would be good for Ethereum and all the smart contract coins. So that's, I think, something that I'm paying attention to, and that I would tell listeners to pay attention to also.
Yeah, absolutely. It's definitely going to be interesting seeing how things play out as we approach that next halving cycle in Bitcoin, which is obviously a big potential catalyst. And you have mentioned, obviously people are going to be looking at different coins, looking for quality. Arguable, some of the coins you mentioned where the quality now. This is one that we've debated for a long time. I've kind of flip-flopped between a long and short, but Solana is one that, of course, has made a roaring comeback. It was definitely at one point perceived as a big risk, especially with the fact that, FTX had such a big holding. It seems that, following the trial, I think, and the release of those coins, that kind of that dark cloud is no longer over Solana. Um, yeah, issue with Solana, I mean, I've written about it a few times. Obviously, very good in terms of scalability. It is quite centralized, right, in terms of the ownership. What are your thoughts on Solana?
It's one of the real head scratchers for me because of what you just mentioned. From a usability standpoint, I've used it. It's phenomenal when it's running and not shut down or whatever, or having network issues. But it does go through those phases where, because of the centralization of it, where you have a few people who can just be like, okay, we're pausing things for now. It's a little too close to traditional banking, I think. I would not put a lot in Solana. Personally, I have lightened up as it has risen. I think my last Seeking Alpha article about Solana, I want to say it was like somewhere, it was under 20, I think, per coin. I think it was like 17 or 18 per coin. And I started lightening up in the high 30s, low 40s. So early, as usual, I always sell my runners a little early. But, I'd rather scale out on the way up than, panic after it's peaked and start selling low. But as fundamentally from Solana, it's a tough one, because you have so many L2s built on Ethereum that offer what Solana offers, but that are in the Ethereum ecosystem, which Solana is not. So Solana doing a go it alone type of strategy will be difficult. And, some of the other, ETH-based chains that I've focused on in the past, back in the blockchain reaction days, one was Celo. And Celo just announced recently that they're going to go from being a standalone thing to an ETH L2. So you look at those types of things and you kind of see, okay, like ETH, is that probably the winner in smart contracts? It looks that way. So that makes Solana maybe riskier. You got a lot of people who are pumping Solana now too, like people who have been, VCs in crypto, people who, have been on Real Vision. When you see a lot of these guys kind of agreeing at the same time, that's when I think you want to be a little bit cautious. And that's not to say that they don't do good work. It's just when you see consensus starting to, brew, just think about it from the other perspective,
Yeah, it's certainly an interesting one, I think, in terms of use. Of course, Solana does have a lot of, let's say, backing from, perhaps people who are more interested in, getting it out of there more than maybe more decentralized protocol, right? Which maybe, isn't going to have, to that extent, the centralization kind of makes it more appealing in some ways, but of course, fundamentally less appealing, right?
Yeah, totally. Like, I think that when you see these types of runs that we've seen in some of these coins, that's when you think, okay, the trade worked great, but now we've got to get back to fundamentals and see if this is justified much longer. And when you have some of the things that I just mentioned that are up 500% or whatever, which ones make sense to fade and which ones make sense to let them still ride. And I think if you're looking at something like Thorchain compared to something like Solana, I'm sticking with Rune over Sol. That's just me personally, because I see the cross-chain utility being a much better fundamental thesis than something that's competing completely out of the ecosystem that's already seeming to be winning. Does that make sense?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And now I'm curious because, when I look at something like cryptocurrencies, well, when I look at anything, I do like to do a bit of charting work to maybe try and identify good levels to sell. When you look at something like Solana or other cryptocurrencies, and you say you've been, for example, taking some profit now, what exactly are you looking at in terms of, taking profits in an altcoin?
So I like to look at, I don't know Elliott Wave as well as you do, so I can't really comment there, but what I generally look for is pretty standard, what I view as trend line, diagonal trends, and horizontal resistance and support levels. And when I see that, matching with an RSI or a MACD that I think is showing something is getting really exhausted to one side, that's when I start thinking, okay, like we're getting close to the top here for whatever this cycle might be. And I just keep it pretty simple. I don't get too into the weeds on TA.
Mm-hmm. Of course, that makes sense. And now you've mentioned a coin that we've talked about a few times before, and of course it's done really, really well. I want to say since it hit the lows, so maybe 300, 400%. That is a ThorChain, Rune. You wrote a piece on Substack. For those that are not familiar, just give us a quick overview. What is Rune, and just what makes it so appealing?
Okay, so Rune is one. There are a lot of projects that try to do cross-chain without a centralized mediator. Like, so when you want to swap BTC for ETH, you generally have to go to like a Coinbase or a Binance or something like that to do it inexpensively. That brings on third-party risk, obviously. So you've seen a lot of people try to build bridges or cross-chain swap protocols. ThorChain is the latter. It's a cross-chain swap protocol. It's not really a bridge. What they do differently is they make essentially trading pairs to their native currency, Rune, RUNE, with everything that they have compatibility with. And so far, I think there are 8 chains: Bitcoin, Ethereum, Litecoin, Binance, Avalanche is in there, and a few others. Dogecoin is actually one of them that's in there too for the meme coin traders. But what this does is it allows you to, without even having exposure to Rune as a currency, you can go into any wallet application or DeFi protocol that has ThorChain working behind the scenes, and you can swap Doge for Bitcoin or Bitcoin for Ethereum pretty inexpensively compared to, if you were going to wrap this stuff, like if you're going to trade wrapped Bitcoin on Ethereum for ETH, it's actually more expensive a lot of the time to do that trade than it would be to do Bitcoin for Ethereum directly through ThorChain. So there's, more to it than that. I'm really oversimplifying it, but people can engage with ThorChain without even realizing it, and we've seen some of the evidence of that on Twitter, which is really fun to watch because people, I've seen people are like, ThorChain doesn't, it doesn't fix anything. Look at this app does exactly what ThorChain says it is, and it's like, yeah, that app is using ThorChain, you just don't realize it. But it's fun seeing stuff like that because it kind of gives you some idea into, there's still an edge here. People really don't get it yet, and I think it's one of the protocols that we'll see probably do pretty well. 5-10 years from now. That's my hope, at least, 'cause I have a pretty big position. And there's a reason, though, if you like the idea of ThorChain, then there's a reason why Rune, going long Rune makes sense, or even providing liquidity in the protocol. I do both. So, there are ways to benefit from the protocol being successful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And I fully agree. Obviously, I also, I've owned Rune for some time, and like you agree that, definitely some very interesting applications there. Now, Rune, Solana, more of the old guard, let's say, of altcoins. Any kind of new names do you think could make an appearance this cycle? I've seen a lot of talk on Twitter, and obviously we've seen big moves and stuff like Cass. I'm not sure if you're aware of that one. Any thoughts, for example, on that one in particular?
All right. So because I don't have the service anymore, I sunset Blockchain Reaction earlier this year. Cass was, I think, either the last or the second to last top token idea that I had. And so that one has performed really well too. Cass, I have sold a little bit as well, but I still do have a position there. Cass, the sell on that is that it's a proof of work fair launch coin, which is becoming more of a rare occurrence these days, but it has a different algorithmic approach to the blockchain security. I cannot comment as well on the fundamentals of it as I would have been able to maybe 6 months ago. It's still something that I think is exciting, but anytime you see something like that move as fast as it has, that's when you want to look at the fundamentals. And so one thing that I do is I look at how many people are using it. Is the daily active usage up? Is the account growth up? And with CAS, I don't necessarily see all that. So I see more of a hype with CAS, even if the fundamental, underlying technology of what that network is might be good. The price may be getting ahead of itself.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. No, it's definitely an interesting project out there. And just wanted to have one more altcoin, because this is also one that I believe the first time I saw it, saw someone write about it was you, and that is Render.
Render, yeah. So Render, similar to CAS, in that it is maybe getting ahead of itself from a price standpoint. Render started as a GPU network for like filmmakers, people who maybe wanted to do, if you've been in any kind of media space, you kind of understand what rendering video files can be like. It can, if you don't have the right technology, it can be kind of a pain. And so Render was kind of like a cloud computing service for GPU rendering to allow people to render frames out faster. The token mechanism is supposed to work within that ecosystem. I've liked Render as a thesis, as an idea. I don't know that it's working the way that maybe it's being, the intention is. So in some of the more recent updates with, the frames that they've rendered out, the amount of, there's a stable diffusion level of you can use stable diffusion in there, but it's really benefiting from an AI narrative trade, but it didn't start as that. So when I see stuff like that, I get a little bit nervous. When I see maybe the usage of the actual network isn't as strong as the price makes it seem, I get a little nervous. So Render is one that I've trimmed. I think it's way ahead of itself. Similar to some of the other coins in the ecosystem, I don't know how much you actually need the Render token, possibly, if that makes sense. So can it be replaced by something else? Possibly, yes. I've liked Render in the past. I'm less excited about it now, I guess, is the best way I can explain that.
Yeah, it's definitely interesting, because at the end of the day, it's one of those things where, like you say, which of these coins can be replaced by others? And, it's like in any business, right? A lot of business can, be replaced. At the end of the day, you're looking at other things like how is different, or also even just momentum. A lot of the times, especially, in this environment, it's about kind of like building that momentum, right? And building those kinds of economies of scale.
Yeah, and when I look at Render specifically, I wonder how necessary that token is. And, when you can do certain things with a token that you can't do with another token, that's when something is attractive, like with Rune, for example. Render, I'm not seeing it quite as much. So yeah, AI trade, momentum, all that plays in. That's all I'll say about that.
All right. Well, speaking of things that might or might not be necessary, of course, with the altcoins coming back, what is your outlook for NFTs? Because of course, I think people are going to start looking at these and think, all right, it's time to 100x my investment in some of these JPEG rocks.
Yeah, NFTs. I actually feel the same way that I felt about NFTs for probably the last 2 or 3 years. the pictures. I'm bearish pictures, but I'm a little bit more bullish on, domains, on things that will allow you to, do sign in, log in. The avatars play a part in that, which is like what the pictures are. But I think that things like ENS is more interesting than like Bored Apes, for example. And then going with ENS, I also think that Unstoppable Domains is a very interesting company that does Polygon-based domains. So those types of things, like payment routing, web page building. The thing that I like as a content creator that gets me really excited about the idea of Web3 and NFTs is, I could build a website that then that points to, or I could have a domain, a Web3 domain that points to a website that I build. So that means no more renting URLs. You could actually own something for once. So I like that idea. You get potentially problems with collisions, but I think that when things like this get standardized, you'll be able to eliminate that problem. So I like NFTs just from a digital ownership standpoint. But each individual NFT itself, I would not expect to see highs reached again. And what's interesting about NFTs is if you look at certain data providers, like CryptoSlam is a good one that shows kind of like the NFT volume. Bitcoin is actually becoming a pretty big NFT chain, which is interesting. I think a lot of that is from ordinals and BRC20 stuff, but that's very, very interesting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. It's going to be interesting to see because definitely, it's just a matter of time before, speculation becomes rife against it. We'll definitely see some interesting moves. I'm looking at it a little bit, and even if it's just in order to speculate a little bit at this point.
Yeah, and look, there's nothing wrong with that. Like people speculate in art all the time, and it's no different. I mean, it really isn't. If you are from if you're digital minded first, then you can take some shots. Just don't throw any money at it that you can't afford to lose. With just like all other things.
Right, absolutely. Now, I wanted to zoom out and look a little bit at the broader kind of crypto space, because obviously we've had some very, very interesting developments in recent days. Now, of course, on the one hand, we have that Bitcoin and Ethereum ETFs all kind of pretty much at this point, everyone's assuming it's a done deal. At the same time, I believe at some point last week, a few days ago, we had that, obviously the CEO of Binance, CZ, basically. Well, no, I'm going to let you explain it because I'm not very on top of this right now, I'll be honest. Why don't you give us a quick background of what's happened exactly with CZ and Binance, and just what are your thoughts? What's happening here?
So the DOJ and Binance settled on what was essentially the Binance global exchange, allowing U.S. users to access the platform. And they had a U.S.-based platform version that was supposed to be specifically for the U.S. customer, but that version didn't have all of the functionality that the global version had, and so the U.S. market still wanted access to that other global platform. And rather than, cutting off that access, Binance pretty obviously was aware that U.S. users were just using VPNs and getting access to the full version. It seems as though in some instances we're encouraging that. So this is obviously a problem. There was a years-long investigation from the DOJ, the U.S. Department of Justice, and they reached a settlement. $4.3 billion is what Binance has to pay for these, wrongdoings. And as a result of this settlement as well, CZ is stepping down as CEO. He's an investor in the business too, but he can maintain his investment. He doesn't have to divest, but he's no longer running the show. So, what does that mean for Binance long term? If you look at their proof of reserves, I mean, they have a ton. They're the most capitalized exchange in the entire market. They have plenty of cash. They can easily cover this almost with their stablecoin reserves alone. But we'll see how it plays out. I don't think that this is going to be bad for Binance. I don't think we're going to see like an FTX situation here. I think that there will potentially be implications. I don't know what the exact schedule is for how much time Binance has to pay this $4.3 billion. I think I read somewhere between 15 months and 2 to 3 years. But that is a potential issue if they have to start selling stuff into the market, that if there's no demand for it, we could have some price problems with certain assets. But it's that's a situation where what I would advise people to do is pay attention to the proof of reserves. You can find it on Binance's website. You can find from Nansen. You can find it from CoinGlass. There's a bunch of areas where you can find this stuff. What you don't want to see is you don't want to see these collateralization ratios collapse, or God forbid, go less than 100%, because then we would have real problems.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And I remember looking into the reserves, especially back in the time of the FTX collapse. And like you said, it's a completely different story in terms of the backing that they have. Now, the sentiment I've seen reflected on X is that, basically they're getting rid of CZ and, planting some kind of some guy from the World Economic Council. Basically, just it's all a big overhaul of crypto. Basically, what are your thoughts on that kind of idea?
I mean, yeah, I think that there's very obviously animosity between the establishment and crypto at this point. They're very clearly in fight us mode, which should have been very expected. It's coming on all fronts: DOJ, SEC, Commodities Exchange, like all of it. The thing is yes, you can weed out, bad actors in the central business environment. You can't really do anything about putting this genie back in the bottle of distributed, decentralized digital currencies that can just be created. Like, okay, get rid of Bitcoin. If you can find a way to get rid of Bitcoin somehow, which I don't know that you can, without a quantum computer, then okay, cool. Then something else will just pop up, right? So whether or not, you can get plans from sort of these globalist groups like the WEF and these, these, I don't want to get too crazy here, but, those types of things will happen and probably can happen. Ultimately, it's just a speed bump, like on what's coming. I think that, and it could be wishful thinking, but I feel as though more and more people, especially younger people, are wising up to how stacked against them certain things are, and they're just not going to put up with it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
Does that make, what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Yes, and we won't get too much into conspiracy theories. We did have a whole podcast.
We've done that. Yeah, absolutely.
To that, anyone who wants to check that out, I'll put a link. But it seems like they're kind of caught between them and kind of a sword on the wall here in terms of, I think, to an extent, obviously they would like Bitcoin not to exist. They obviously know they can't stop it, and at the same time, they kind of know that to an extent they need to get their hands on some, because whether it's China or some of the other countries, will be using it, and at the end of the day, it's going to be a useful tool.
That's the beautiful thing about Bitcoin, and I have a lot of issues with certain aspects of Bitcoin, obviously, but I don't think it's perfect like maxis do. But it is wonderful, and wonderful can be good enough. And no single entity controls it. It's completely global. And so when you think about the motivation of each individual group, then, someone is going to champion this and use it as an opportunity, use it as a tool to thwart whatever it is that they're against. And that could come from countries that Americans don't think that they like, and that's too bad, because there's nothing they can do about it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. Now, we have, of course, all those Bitcoin, Ethereum ETFs, getting ready to be launched. Of course, from an ownership perspective, and as we covered before, obviously, it's important to keep ownership of your coins. Now, what we have seen those very interesting is, of course, GBTC, for example, and ETH kind of outperforming the underlying assets because, closing down that discount.
Yeah.
My question now is, are we going to see a premium in your opinion? Because we have seen that before. So from a kind of trading perspective, is it still worth, for example, owning something like GBTC?
I still like GBTC. I still like ETH. I like them a lot less when there is an ETF, a spot ETF. I don't think that they trade at a premium. I don't know why they would. There's a lot of problems with ETH specifically, the Grayscale ETH one, because it's not staked, so it's not actively earning yield. Now, if you were going to stake that, you would bring the yields down because it would be so much that would be coming in. But, and John Miller, I think, for Seeking Alpha, has done pretty good research on that whole thing. But I don't see Grayscale funds ever going back to a premium. At least the top ones, the ones that have a lot in assets under management. Like, we obviously see the ridiculous stuff like Filecoin one and the Solana one was trading at like 10 to 1. But those have like 5 or less million in assets under management. So when you have a bunch of unsophisticated investors who see, oh, cool, GSOL, that's Solana I can get in my brokerage account, like just piling in, that's silly and that's not sustainable. I think what you're going to see with those funds, even when they do convert, assuming they convert to ETFs, is it'll be something more similar to what you see like in the Sprott metal ETFs, which trade usually between 2 to 4% discounts.
Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And now the other element of the crypto space, which I haven't quite covered yet, is miners, which, looking back a few days ago, I would have said they're kind of been lagging Bitcoin a little bit. In the last few days, though, they really began to catch up.
Yeah.
So what are your thoughts on the crypto miners? Do you see them now beginning to catch up with Bitcoin as they begin, as we approach that halving?
I don't like all the miners by any stretch, but I do like a few of them. And I think that halving is the most expected event that we've seen with the miners for the last, 12 months. I know that every article about the miners that I've been writing for a year at least has been the major risk is the halving will reduce block reward by 50%, and it's coming in April of 2024. Anyone who doesn't know this at this point isn't paying attention to these equities, which means if you don't we have to be priced it in at this point, in my opinion. It's got to be. If it's not, then we don't have a forward-looking market, and I don't necessarily believe that yet. So I think the worst is probably over. I think that, when you look at where Bitcoin is probably going to go within the next 18 months, does that mean that miners are more profitable today, or more profitable in 18 months than they are today? I think I want to lean yes, because I think that Bitcoin will be much higher. The block reward will obviously have been halved by then, but that net, I believe, for the miners will work out. So yeah, there's a couple of miners that I like a lot. There's some that I have that are really just trades, but most of them I think are going to either get bought out or are going to have some serious issues when the economics of the halving is seen.
Yeah, now miners we've talked about before. You've mentioned a couple in previous podcasts. CleanSpark, for example, being one. One that I saw you wrote about back towards the end of August, and then I've become a bit interested in recently, is Iris Energy. Can you talk us a little bit about that one?
So Iris Energy has, for its existence, always sold production every month, which has been an interesting approach. I think the only other miner that does that is TeraWulf. But more recently, Iris has also decided to get into the generative AI space. Mm-hmm. So, they're basically focused on just building data centers, and part of that data center will be Bitcoin mining, and part of it will be artificial intelligence related GPU products, cloud-based products, I assume. So I think it's an interesting name. I'm not as big of a fan of Iris as I was maybe a year ago. I think that going forward, there's a lot of competition for the AI thing, a lot. And, you see it with Applied Digital, which is now having issues, mostly related to B. Riley. You see it with Bit Digital, which is one that I actually do like. They're getting aggressive about AI. Hive, Hut 8 is trying to do it. And, there are a lot of these companies, particularly the ones that had exposure to Ethereum mining before the merge, excuse me. A lot of them had the GPUs already, so it makes sense. But I think that the data center narrative is going to have a lot of competition. I think that if you're looking for a Bitcoin miner, a pure play Bitcoin miner, you only have like 2 or 3 that are worth your time, and CleanSpark is definitely one of them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Now, we've talked about Bitcoin, and you've kind of mentioned that you expect the Bitcoin price, obviously, as we approach the halving, to increase. Now, I wonder how you relate that kind of thesis with the broader market. Now, I do remember in our last podcast, you disclosed that you had a short position. At the time, it was a little bit underwater. I remember you saying, I was just looking, pretty much that podcast, by the time I posted it, it's, your short position, if you held on to it, I don't know. I don't know what happened to that. Would have done pretty well, right? I think the market came down eventually to about that 4,000 level. Of course, now, obviously, we've had a massive rally. We're back towards those year-to-date highs. So I'm wondering how you, and I think in general, I've seen you post about the market kind of more bearishly. So how exactly do you see the market and Bitcoin performing in that way? And how do you see, do you see that kind of dichotomy playing out?
It's interesting. We're kind of referencing correlation, Bitcoin's correlation to the broader market, like NASDAQ or the S&P. I think it's a great question. I really don't know. I know that, so I did close my market short, which was expressed through SPXS at a very, very small profit. I'm lucky that I got out when I did, to be honest. I'm still expressing a short trade through the NVIDIA short ETF, NVDS. That has not gone well. But I've been averaging that down, X shares a time for weeks. And that position is now only down, I think, like 4%. So I have a lot of confidence that is gonna do fine. But the broad market is a real head scratcher for me, because it just kind of rallies on whatever narrative it needs to rally, and so I've complained, bitched about the breadth issue. I have a lot of exposure to I don't have a lot of exposure to the Magnificent Seven, so for me this has been a painful thing to watch, because I have a lot of stocks that are lower in the Russell, and I take shots on stuff that hasn't done well. And I look at it like, okay, so if you're going to tell me that the whole equity market is going to go up, then these things should be doing okay, and they're not. Why is that? Well, it's because it's only 7 actual stocks that are doing well. But when they eventually roll, is that going to see the Russell then be the place where that capital flows? Probably. So that would likely mean that the market keeps going up. I'm not really sure. I think that we're obviously starting to see expectations for a cut in March. I haven't checked the CME probability in a few days, so I don't know where that is right now. But when I last looked, it was like 25% chance of a cut in March. I would say people want to remember the rate cycle before 2019 cut. Because in 2019, when they started cutting, everything went up. I don't know if that's going to happen again, because I think the economy is in a different position. But, the thing that makes this so difficult to predict is that it's all going to be dependent on what about 10 people decide to do, in the Federal Reserve Bank. And if they just decide, okay, we're not going to let it go down, then they'll put the spigot back on and you'll find a bottom, and then it'll all go back up. That's what we've been trained to believe. So I think that where Bitcoin is different is that you have the halving component. You have so many people who dollar cost average every month, every week, whatever it is. And so I don't see, unless you have huge layoff scenario, I don't see, which is possible, by the way. I feel like the people who dollar cost average are going to keep doing that. And so if there's less of it to go around and all these hodlers are not selling at, 50 or 60 or 70K, less block reward, people still keep buying it, no one's selling at that price, it's going to go up. That's just how I see it playing out.
Yeah, it's definitely interesting. Like you said, we have some precedent there. For example, like you said, in the previous halving cycle when they cut, we also have, for example, I made the comparison with towards 2007 when the Fed did pause and we did actually see that rally. I mean, from a macro perspective, I do see a lot of a lot of factors that could push risk assets high. The dollar topping and perhaps rates also at the very least experiencing some kind of a pullback. I mean, you look at some charts and you can also correlate Bitcoin very strongly with what people call global liquidity.
Yep.
Of course, markets and Bitcoin, and there is an argument to be made, that global liquidity could begin to turn up. So, but I guess to me it seems like it's hard to see one rallying without the other. I mean, I think like we say, a rising tide lifts all boats. But at the same time, if we did see a credit event like let's say COVID, I mean, we did see Bitcoin sell off there. So
we did, yeah.
But it's also interesting, then we have seen kind of the opposite happen, with, when, for example, the banks collapsed, we did see, for example, Bitcoin actually perform quite well at that point. So, that could be perhaps a situation also where, you get a liquidity event, but, this time Bitcoin actually kind of emerges as the kind of a safety asset, right?
And think back about what happened in Cyprus, in 2012 or 2013, I think it was. Bitcoin, that was Bitcoin's coming out party because there was a bank bail-in. And now imagine that happening on a global scale and not being limited to just like one jurisdiction. Like, I think that, what I look at right now is I think equities will do fine. Like, if the liquidity is back, then equities will keep going. Will they do better than Bitcoin? Even to a degree, gold, like silver, I just don't know that I would agree with that at this point. Especially with them, I mean, they're already trading at like, what's the average PE for the S&P? What is it, like 25? What's the dividend yield of the S&P? Like 1.5? I mean, debt to GDP ratio is ridiculous. I know that's not stocks, that's public debt, but I see a lot of problems that I think will at least handicap the equities to a larger degree than something like Bitcoin or even gold, which is, like a hedge on the whole system.
Right, yeah. I think moving forward, people might be surprised, but it seems like crypto and Bitcoin might be the safe bet here, so to speak.
I think so.
But as far as you're concerned, NVIDIA is still fucked, right?
I'm not Gaiad, but yeah, NVIDIA is still fucked. No, look, I've recently started following the StockTwits feed for NVIDIA, and I'm just laughing because I see so much of what I saw, when I was on StockTwits a lot more with companies that were shit that kept just going up. And I'm seeing a lot of the same hubris. And look, NVIDIA has had an amazing run and is doing wonderfully. But they will have competition soon. We're already seeing problems with China. I mean, if your cost basis is under 100 and you're not taking profit at 500 in a company that doesn't have a moat in 5 years, what is wrong with you? Like, how much more do you want? You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
So I don't know. I think that they're fucked, but I've been wrong.
yeah, it's definitely an interesting one. I mean, at the very least, like you say, they're going to face. I think that the China problem is definitely an overhead. And on the other hand, whether you kind of buy into that whole core weave stuff that we exposed and I
For
exposed
sure.
so a few months ago.
Yeah.
You look at the latest report, and they do seem to be accumulating more and more accounts payable. So at the very least, that's also a risk, I would say. Especially if the AI mania kind of dies down. There's 8 billion there that there's a significant impairment loss potentially.
That podcast that you're referencing is a great listen. I would say anyone should listen to that one. There's really good independent research being done on Twitter, of course. The people on YouTube who are bringing up the problems are not randos. Like, these are smart people who are doing the work. They're doing the due diligence, and they shouldn't be ignored.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's definitely interesting. Anyway, on to something a little bit brighter and better. The country that isn't fucked is Argentina.
Yes.
Just elected. I'm actually here in Buenos Aires. I was here during the elections, enjoying the commotion. So they've just elected what I guess we could describe as the first ever libertarian president.
It depends on how you define libertarian. I mean, I won't hide it from. I view myself as that. I think that Malay's social libertarianism, I would question. His fiscal libertarianism is on point, which makes for a very interesting case study here in Argentina. I would actually ask you, what's the vibe been like there? You're there.
Yeah, it's been pretty interesting. I was here over the weekend when they were voting. Ironically, though, because it's a long weekend, it seems like a lot of people in Buenos Aires just leave. They go to the beach, so it wasn't actually very busy. I thought it was very interesting. They don't sell alcohol 48 hours ahead of the election. I don't know.
Interesting.
Or I'm not sure what the purpose is. I don't know if it's like they don't want people to vote drunk. I don't know.
Too late.
I also think it's interesting. Well, I guess there's a few countries that do this, but it is supposed to be legally obliged to vote in Argentina, I think.
Oh, interesting. So you have to.
Yeah, but it's definitely been
Careful what you wish for then, establishment. You might just get a libertarian.
Exactly. I think it's interesting. I think talking to from people. I think I mentioned this in a post I did on Substack where my my Airbnb host kind of talked about Milei as the Trump of Argentina. And, I do think that sentiment is definitely kind of shared with a lot in terms of kind of a bit crazy as the outsider. I mean, I don't know if you've seen some crazy reports about him, I don't know, cloning his dog and
something like that.
Or something like that.
Well,
I haven't looked into it, but I can see why the mainstream would run a smear campaign. But anyway, it's definitely interesting. I think the big difference is, of course, that Argentina over the last year, 140% inflation. I mean, there's just no other choice for the people, and even
what do you do? Like, I mean, if you're in that position and you're dealing with the amount of ineptitude that you're dealing with and the inflation that you're dealing with, everyone gets to a point where they're just like, okay, the risk reward of just pushing the trigger on the bomb and blowing it up, it just makes more sense to do that. And it seems like Argentina's there. Good for them. They've got a fighting chance. For Milei, I do understand the Trump comparisons. I think that politically speaking, he's actually very different, but from a disruption standpoint, that definitely makes a lot of sense. It's interesting to me that he's choosing to dollarize rather than doing something completely different, like what El Salvador did with Bitcoin. I understand it. Politically, it's probably something that you can't do on the campaign trail, but maybe, down the line. Because the thing is, okay, dollarizing is great because it's the reserve currency and it's more stable than your own, but it also has a lot of problems. And, you could just be putting these people through another hyperinflation soon, which look, I'm not saying that the dollar is going to hyperinflate, but I'm not saying that it's a zero probability that it could hyperinflate. So, what happens with that is actually, it might make sense politically too, because he's essentially saying central banks, it's not negotiable. They're gone. Like, we're not doing it. And we're going to use this other currency that we can't fuck with. And if the people running the dollar fuck with it, then okay, we made a mistake. But, I'm not the one who messed up the currency. It's somebody else. And if that does happen, then, maybe you do see them go El Salvador and start using things that are based on code and not man-made, man making decisions. So I'm rooting for them. I can't wait to see how it goes.
Yeah, like you said, it's definitely very interesting. And like you said, I mean, from an ideological standpoint, it does seem like, well, you say, you don't want the central bank, but you're just replacing it with
you just picked a different central bank, right? Yep.
Exactly. But, again, from a practical sense, I do think that it makes a lot more sense to use the dollar, even though it has its problems, as they say, it's still the cleanest shirt in the laundry, right?
Right.
Well, I mean, Bitcoin would definitely be a challenge. I don't know how it's actually going in El Salvador these days. I'm having a look.
It depends on who you read. You'll have some who will say it's a resounding success, like the Max Kaisers of the world, and then you'll have, like the Vices and the New York Times will tell you how it's just this stink disaster. And the truth is probably somewhere in the middle.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but at the very least, it's it definitely shows a shift in thinking. Like I said, I have a lot of some Argentinian friends, who I wouldn't describe as libertarian at all, but it's interesting because my Argentinian friends, I would say, are surprisingly more like, well, what's the choice, right? Let's get this guy do something different. Whereas, people who know a bit less about it and maybe just have a more superficial understanding, just like, oh, how could they, pick this crazy, extreme right-wing guy, right?
Yeah, I think that when you're not in that situation, it can be difficult. And I think the reason why, specifically, here in the U.S., Bitcoin is even a tough sell sometimes, depending on, your socioeconomic status or your, maybe your generation plays into it as well. But people can't fathom why you would need something like that when, finance is just so easy and banking is just so easy. And, when we have, I think, maybe everywhere, people have just a difficult time putting themselves in someone else's shoes and seeing it from their perspective. Like, I'm in America and have a ton of privilege as a result of that, especially financially. But I completely understand why someone who's dealing with 150% inflation would be like, fuck this, let's blow it up. Like, duh. Yes, try something else.
Yeah, absolutely. It's definitely very interesting. Like I said, I've been here for a few weeks. It's kind of interesting. I don't know if you know how it works here. You have the official exchange rate, which is obviously pretty terrible. So then you go to the black market, and basically it's triple
rate.
I will say it's quite interesting. I think for the last year now, if you use credit cards, you actually do get a pretty similar rate to the actual black market one, which is pretty good. But there aren't any obstacles really to getting the exchange rate. But I will say, and this is, I think, something that I heard Lyd Alden talk about. She was talking about being in Egypt, where there's also been a lot of inflation. But, it is true that you look around and it isn't actually that bad, at least, from what I've seen in Buenos Aires. I mean, inflation happens, but, life goes on in the end. I think at the end of the day, people have jobs and kind of, life goes on. I mean, things could be better, but,
Well, when they get a taste of stability, I mean, you never know. Like, they may think, what were we doing waiting this long? And then you may see other countries that are waiting, not wait anymore. Mm-hmm. You just never know.
Yeah, it'll definitely be interesting. Gold standard, Bitcoin standard, we'll see. Casper standard.
A Polygon standard.
Just not a Solana standard.
No Solana standard. No, we don't need that.
All right. Well, it's been great talking to you, Mike. As always, where can we send people to find you on the internet?
Yeah, it's always a pleasure. Thanks again for having me on. You can go to my Substack. You can just search for it. It's Heretic Speculator is the name of the publication, and the URL is Faybomb, college nickname, faybomb.substack.com. So FAYBOMB.substack.com. I generally post, I would say 2 to 4 times per week. And then there's a paywalled service on top of it, which is going to look a little bit different next year, but you'll get portfolio access, you'll get exclusive content, full archive, typical stuff. $10 a month, $100 for a year. It's pretty cheap. So just trying to help people understand these things the way that I do. I'm not a financial professional. I'm just a guy who's in my basement with a bunch of crap behind me who looks at charts and looks at white papers and all these things and just makes some bets. So you can go on that journey with me if you want.
Awesome. Well, absolutely. Highly recommend you guys check it out. I can definitely say, at least for myself, I've extracted a lot of value from your ideas and definitely profited from some of them. So, go ahead. Do yourself a favor, check it out. And thanks again for coming on, and hope we can do this again sometime.
Anytime. Appreciate it, James.
All right. Thanks, Mike.